Some people have said sometimes that if there were an area particularly where there were concerns, women maybe being assaulted or feeling particularly scared, that there should be a curfew on men for a period of time. Is that something that you would consider?
On the 9th of March 2001, a famously eccentric Colombian mayor conducted a social experiment where men were asked to stay at home and observe a nighttime curfew, while women were encouraged to go out and enjoy an evening of open-air concerts, cultural events and women-only happy hours. The purpose of the experiment, he called A Night Without Men, was to address crime rates in Colombia's capital city that at the time was one of the most violent in the world, and also to encourage social reflection, with men invited to step into women's shoes by staying home to cook and care for children, thus highlighting the domestic burden often left to women in a traditionally macho society. 23 years later, an Oxford professor in criminal law would cite Bogotá's Night Without Men as evidence that it would be possible to enforce a curfew for all men living in the UK. What's more, he proposed that current human rights laws actually imposes an obligation on Parliament to introduce one as a proportionate means of achieving the legitimate aim of addressing an epidemic of male violence against women and girls. The purpose of this presentation, therefore, is to politely provide Professor Herring with a logical and, some might say, staggeringly obvious alternative to his apparently sincere proposal that the UK government has an obligation under human rights law to severely subjugate half the country solely on the basis of sex.
Alright, gentlemen, let's do this.
10 metres from my own front door.
You guys never learn, do you? You could be 10 centimetres and we'd get you. You don't fuck with curfew.
On the 1st of April 2022, Jane Cowie published her debut novel, After Dark, a murder mystery set in a dystopian near-future Britain, where violence against women has been eradicated thanks to an act of Parliament imposing a strict nationwide nighttime curfew on all men and boys over the age of 10. After Dark has been described as a gender reversal of Margaret Atwood's dystopian classic, The Handmaid's Tale. Although such surface comparisons are somewhat misleading, most obviously because Atwood's vision of an authoritarian state humanises the oppressed class enough to make the oppression that they experience appear horrifying to any rational thinking reader. Then again, from Jane Cowie's perspective, perhaps the oppressed class in both tales are the women. Her narrative certainly offers extremely limited regard towards any inconveniences men and boys may encounter as a consequence of strict state-imposed restrictions, including the requirement to wear a permanent ankle tag so that their movements can be tracked 24 hours a day. Significantly, after submitting her first draft to her publisher, the main advice she received back was to rein in a negative portrayal of male characters and give them at least some redeeming features. Having read the published version, I'm not certain she took their advice. That said, Cowie's female characters aren't especially endearing either. Or, as she puts it, they are not necessarily that well behaved. And across the novel and TV adaptation, we witness them committing a range of prosecutable crimes, including abuse of the legal system, perverting the course of justice, coercive control, domestic abuse, blackmail, harassment, false allegations, parental alienation, sex-selective abortion, weaponization of curfew, criminal damage, forced entry, common assault, grievous bodily harm with intent, assault on an emergency worker, manslaughter, attempted murder, and at least 2 murders. Incredibly, before After Dark had even hit the bookshelves, the concept of an all-male curfew had made an unlikely journey from outlandish fringe thought experiment to potential public policy position. This leap occurred in March 2021 when a member of the Green Party championed the concept in Parliament during a debate on domestic abuse.
I would argue that at the next opportunity for any bill that's appropriate, I might actually put in an amendment to create a curfew for men on the streets after 6 p.m, which I feel would make women a lot safer.
Baroness Jones's proposal was obviously a relatively transparent rage-baiting stunt, and When public outrage inevitably followed, she quickly rode back her comments to clarify that she was not entirely serious. And yet, just one day later, the First Minister of Wales, no less, was forced to issue a statement clarifying that he was not introducing a curfew for men, nor was he seriously considering it, after telling the BBC that in a crisis, he would seriously consider exactly such a thing.
I can only take it from that you could not rule out that being a potentially something that you would do.
If there were a crisis and you needed to take dramatic action that allowed that crisis to be drawn down, then of course you'd be prepared to consider all measures that would make a difference. But the sort of measure, the curfew measure that you've described, it could only ever be a temporary answer, and therefore it's not at the top of our list. There are other things that we can do and should do. As I say, people need to be safe and to feel safe.
Such a seemingly unlikely public policy precedent occurred against the backdrop of two significant moments in history. Firstly, in March 2020, the Mother of Parliaments crossed an unprecedented civil liberties Rubicon by voting in favour of imposing a 23-hour home curfew on the majority of not just men across the UK, but women also. And tragically, 12 months later, a Metropolitan Police constable exploited those very restrictions to detain, handcuff, abduct, rape and strangle a 33-year-old woman named Sarah Everard before burning her body and disposing of her remains. Widespread criticism of the enforcement of lockdown laws at a subsequent public vigil proved to be a critical turning point in the enforcement of this by then year-long curfew. And within days, the government announced a speedy roadmap to the end of all restrictions. The murder also triggered widespread debate about men's violence against women and led to supporters of a male curfew concept arguing that if police could suggest that women should stay indoors for their own safety, it is logically consistent for them to restrict the movements of potential perpetrators instead. This essentially is the same dubious moral equivalency argument presented by Professor Herring in support of his call for a real-life curfew. In his peer-reviewed paper published 3 years later, in an edition of the International Journal of Gender, Sexuality and Law, entirely dedicated to reflections on the world envisaged in Jane Cory's novel. All of which brings me to my response to Professor Herring's challenge to propose a more effective way of protecting women's rights than the implementation of a 12-hour statewide all-male curfew, which is rather obviously to do absolutely nothing, or more specifically, certainly do not implement a curfew of any kind. There are three logical reasons for this inaction, beginning with the UK government's obligation to protect women from bad men. It may take her 45 of her book's 49 chapters to get round to mentioning it, but in fairness to Jane Cory, unlike the 2024 TV adaptation, she does at least ultimately draw attention to curfew's most glaringly obvious flaw. Because her story eventually reveals that Helen, her dystopian murder mystery victim, is killed by her boyfriend and state-approved cohabitation partner, who murders her in her own home. He discovers a way to remove his 24-hour tracking tag so that he can leave the house undetected and dump her body under cover of night. Don't ask how, it doesn't really matter, and we're never really told. This twist is clearly intended to be devastating precisely because it highlights the reality that most violence against women is committed by men that they know, and most commonly inside their own home. After Dark's darkest irony, therefore, is that a male curfew would create a scenario where homes can potentially become prisons for victims of domestic abuse, most especially for victims required by law not to exit the property until 7 a.m. Even so, Herring largely sidesteps this matter by arguing that any failures to tackle abuse in domestic settings should not be seen as an excuse not to tackle abuse in public places. So on that not entirely convincing basis, let's move on to the second layer of the argument against curfew, which addresses the concept of not all men. This concept invites public policy makers to consider the serious issue of men's violence against women from the perspective of a woman encountering a man on a street at night, or being spoken to by him in a public space. Such encounters frequently cause anxieties for women, because it is impossible for them to know whether or not they have encountered a good man until it's potentially too late. Professor Herring argues that from this perspective, the obligation to ensure women's access to public spaces without fear cannot be achieved by restricting curfew to men who have already revealed themselves to be bad. Such logic is significantly similar to the scenario that led to the UK-wide lockdown in 2020 and a subsequent more than year-long new normal that had catastrophic long-term consequences for many. And based on that recent precedent, it may not be entirely unrealistic to think that 30 million plus men and boys and a reasonably similar number of women and girls who love them might accept similar sex-specific restrictions with relatively little fuss, if such a measure could be convincingly sold to them as for the greater good, combined obviously with a significant amount of coercive control. But then again, the erosion of civil liberties and creation of a two-tier surveillance system required to achieve Professor Herring's legitimate aim could lead to a dramatic fracture in social cohesion and trust in institutions, most especially trust in the police, whose function would pivot from neutral protectors to enforcers of a strictly segregated, sectarian-based control society. One not altogether distant example from history certainly supports such a possibility, and it's no coincidence that it occurred in a region that now has the most extensive civil rights legal framework in the entire UK.
It wasn't a bomb, but it was an ambush, because when the troops arrived, fire was opened up down the road.
For the uninitiated, Operation Demetrius was a British Army operation in Northern Ireland in 1971. At the time, it was rationalised as a proportionate means of achieving the legitimate aim of addressing an epidemic of violence caused by the IRA. The operation involved the mass arrest and imprisonment without trial of almost 2,000 men over a 4-year period, with the treatment of some determined to be inhumane and degrading by the European Court of Human Rights. Many of those arrested were innocent and included several prominent civil rights activists. Far from quelling the violence, the year following its introduction became the bloodiest of the Troubles, with almost 500 deaths. And ultimately, the operation backfired spectacularly, alienating the Roman Catholic community, boosting IRA recruitment, and sparking major civil disobedience. Operation Demetrius was obviously less ambitious than the one imagined by Cowie. Nevertheless, and once again, if we take Cowie's world building seriously for a moment, then perhaps 30 million plus men and boys would go quietly to their rooms every night. And so, on that not entirely convincing basis, we can proceed to the third and final aspect of the argument against curfew, and the not insignificant implications of even one night without good men. Jane Cowie's examination of potential broader societal impacts arising from her vision of curfew are narrowly restricted to positives addressing a common checklist of fourth wave feminist talking points, including reversals of pay gaps, representations in Parliament, occupational segregation and household divisions of labour. Revealingly, these are celebrated as dramatic reversals as opposed to equitable equalisations. And nevertheless, some adverse impacts affecting women would also be inevitable. By way of example, authoritarian restrictions on men's movements would inevitably inflict severe multi-layered and multi-generational economic damage, including an estimated 10% immediate reduction in GDP. Men comprise 70 to 80% of night shift workers in many UK sectors, and roughly 50% of consumers, meaning that the UK's nighttime economy, worth 66 billion annually, would collapse almost immediately overnight. Over 90% of bus, train, taxi and pedicab drivers are male, meaning that the transport sector would essentially collapse during curfew hours. The dirty and dangerous dad job sector, including sanitation and logistics, would suffer a total collapse in efficiency. Delivery services, long-haul trucking and 24/7 warehouse operations would be decimated, and the just-in-time supply chain would collapse within 48 hours.
Transport and communications infrastructure, homes and businesses all suffered power cuts this evening in large parts of the country. The National Grid said issues with 2 generators brought blackouts to London and the South East, as well as the Midlands, the South West and Wales, the North East and North West of England too.
There would be an almost immediate operational collapse in the UK's critical utilities infrastructure. The energy sector is approximately 70% to 80% male, rising to almost 99% in emergency repair and frontline engineering roles. Power station shift patterns would be decimated. 70% plus reduction in staff available during nighttime hours would risk total national grid failure. The safety and supply of drinking water would also be severely compromised, given that water treatment is also a 24/7 operation, and curfew would restrict availability of the majority of plant operators. A digital blackout would be almost inevitable, given that the telecom sector is close to 90% male, and critical internet and mobile infrastructure maintenance is scheduled during maintenance windows between 12 and 6 a.m. The farming and agriculture sectors would also be fundamentally disrupted. Women would be required to almost exclusively meet the burden for necessary out of traditional hours working. As a consequence, the gender pay gap would reverse superficially, but overall average household incomes would fall significantly, increasing levels of poverty, especially for low-income families unable to adapt. This would be further impacted by a severe cost of living crisis caused by a rapid spike in the price of essential goods. Although the health sector is predominantly female, the 22% of male workers are particularly concentrated in areas vital for nighttime operations, including emergency response and senior clinical roles. Implementation costs of tagging 30 plus million males would be astronomical, with running costs for monitoring centres and expanding prisons exceeding 10 to 20 billion annually. Mixed sex friendships and dating would become logistically nightmarish, exacerbating loneliness epidemics, already especially acute amongst young men. Levels of substance abuse would also spike dramatically. Birth rates would fall even further than they have already, accelerating demographic decline and even further straining pensions and care systems. Millions more fatherless homes would emerge from curfew breaches and separations, leading to long-term developmental challenges for many women, sometimes referred to as fatherless daughter syndrome. The dehumanisation of the male population would inevitably create a mental health emergency. The internalisation of being perceived as a perpetual suspect from the age of 10, combined with the lack of agency and social isolation during the 12-hour curfew, would lead to enhanced levels of depression and suicide. Crippling restrictions on males would also lead to societal preference for daughters. For example, in Cowie's novel, Helen decides to abort her child, specifically because he is male. Long-term innovation and entrepreneurship would suffer significantly due to a massive brain drain. Many UK and internationally owned businesses would relocate operations overseas. Inequality would widen by class, perpetuating cycles of poverty and crime. Male migration numbers into the kingdom would fall dramatically. Male emigration would rise to levels likely to cause a refugee intake crisis in Ireland and other immediate neighbouring countries. International relations would suffer dramatically, affecting trade, tourism, soft power, political, strategic and military alliances. Foreign nations may even eventually move to invade the United Kingdom and pillage resources under the guise of regime change necessitated by severe human rights violations. Indeed, foreign military intervention may likely be both inevitable and broadly supported by institutions such as the United Nations, NATO and the European Union, given the catastrophic implications for both the UK's nuclear energy industry and its nuclear deterrent, both of which are typically 80% male in technical and operational roles, highly regulated for safety and security, and dependent on continuous shift work. A curfew would trigger immediate safety compromises and national security vulnerabilities. Human error in control rooms or maintenance could have catastrophic Chernobyl-level possibilities. In the event of a high-intensity war on the scale of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, military analysts suggest that the UK could face up to 1,500 casualties per day of combat. This may likely involve predominantly female casualties, as many male combatants may stand down, or possibly even take action in support of the invader. And as contemporary conflicts have shown us, regime change can be extremely difficult to achieve, as those in power are rarely prepared to go quietly into the night. Chillingly, therefore, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that one potential adverse impact arising from a UK-wide male curfew could involve the first ever land invasion of a country capable of defending itself with nuclear weapons. Incidentally, if Professor Herring has read further than the Daily Mail article he cites in his paper, then presumably he will know that Colombia's 2001 male curfew was entirely voluntary, that around 200,000 men chose not to honour it, and many who did so on the basis of the social contract the mayor made with them, by hosting a night without women the following week. Meanwhile, Jane Cowie claims that she doesn't seriously support the implementation of a curfew, although oddly, the book club section at the end of her novel includes such curious questions as, what would it take to bring in a curfew in real life? How else do you think men would benefit from a curfew? And what other restrictions could be considered? Chillingly, her dystopian tale concludes with the revelation that more bad men have discovered ways to remove their tags, so that they can go out and murder women after dark. Don't ask how, it doesn't really matter, and we're never really told. And consequently, millions of women march on an overwhelmingly female parliament, demanding that the matriarchy take even more action to defend them from bad men. If absolute power corrupts absolutely, then perhaps it should also be said that absolute idiocy causes losses to everyone, without any gain for itself.
Stupid.